On Wednesday the 24th of January, just last week, a 22-year-old man named Darius Appiah was last seen picking up his dinner from a restaurant in Stafford, Virginia, before he would mysteriously disappear. At the time, he was supposed to be heading home after work along Mine Road when an unassuming restaurant employee would briefly glance at the young man, not thinking too much of it. However, little did they know, this would be the last official sighting of Darius, as his phone would suddenly shut off an hour later and hasn't turned back on since. Later that night, his father became concerned given that Darius still hadn't arrived home as planned. So as this behaviour was very unlike his son, he decided to officially report the 22-year-old man as missing to the local police. Search parties were then organised and images of Darius were quickly posted across the news and social media in the hopes that somebody would recognise his face. And eventually, his car was traced back to a local park where it was locked and abandoned, with the food still inside. However, after 1 week of searching the surrounding area, the young man still remains missing to this day, which has understandably led many to wonder, what really happened to Darius Appiah, and could he be Virginia's next victim of human trafficking? Darius Joshua Appiah was born in 2001 to his loving parents Eunice and Maxwell Appiah in the state of Virginia. Little is known about his younger years, but from what I was able to gather, Darius was an extremely well-behaved child with an intensely loving nature. According to his father, he could not remember one single instance where Darius did anything remotely wrong, which would explain why he would grow up to be such a happy, well-adjusted person. A strong reason behind this was likely the religious-based upbringing he received from his parents, as they both served as pastors at the Revelation City Church in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where Darius would pick up these personality traits. However, as he moved into adolescence with this rather quiet nature, he would find himself lacking a solid group of friends or any real long-term romantic relationships, and so it appeared that he was more compelled to spend time alone in his room, which was where he always felt most comfortable. But this more introverted personality certainly didn't restrict his selfless and giving nature, as his father Maxwell would also go on to explain how Darius once offered up 10 pairs of his own shoes to be sent to Africa, as they were planning on going back to Maxwell's hometown to see family at the time. So based on this, I think it would be safe to say that Darius was certainly a kind-hearted person with the whole world at his feet, and he would inevitably take these traits also into the workplace, where he was a devoted member of his team. However, although it is still unknown which job he was holding down at the time, it would be after one of his many regular shifts that something irregular would suddenly occur, when Darius would fail to return home on that fateful day in January. On Wednesday the 24th of January, the 22-year-old man clocked out after finishing his shift at work at around 2 p.m. before heading off to his dark green 2004 Lexus SUV to drive home. However, despite his usual routine of driving straight home after work, this time he strangely decided to pull out his phone and open up the DoorDash app to place an order for a collection. Once the order was placed, he then strapped himself in and put his key in the ignition, before pulling out of the parking spot and driving towards Mine Road in Spotsylvania County. After a relatively short drive, he then arrived at his destination, and as soon as he got the notification to say his food was ready, he got out of the car and walked towards the restaurant. He then greeted the cashier before being handed his takeout and walking back outside in the direction of his SUV, and then he climbed back inside, placing his food on the passenger seat. However, little did the cashier know, this would be the last official sighting of Darius Appiah. At this point, we can only speculate on what happened next, but from the evidence that was later uncovered, it would seem that the young man then started up his car once again, before pulling off and heading in an unknown direction. A few hours later, his mother Eunice had agreed to hold a sermon in their basement with some other members of the church, but due to the nature of the service, she knew it would be a long night, so wanting to make sure her children were fed, she offered to make some dinner for her son Christian. However, given that her other son Darius was due to be home soon, she wondered if he would be wanting dinner as well. so she pulled out her cell phone and attempted to call him right away. But to her surprise, the phone didn't ring for long, as it had gone straight to voicemail. At first, she wasn't too concerned, as she just assumed he was probably speaking on the phone at the time, and so the call got rejected. But after waiting for 5 minutes, she tried to call him again, but just as before, the call went straight to voicemail. Well, with concerns slightly rising, she didn't understand why her son couldn't at least keep her updated with a quick message to say he would call her back as he normally would. So she sent through a text message herself in the hopes he would respond when ready. However, as the hours ticked by with no response from Darius, Eunice really started to panic. According to his parents, Darius was always described as a very regimented person who would frequently get early nights, so as the clock struck 9 PM, with still no sign of the young man, Eunice checked her phone one last time to see if there were any texts or calls from her son. But once again, there was no response, leaving his mother extremely worried. So with little else to try, she then attempted to call him for a third time. But on this occasion, she would choose to leave a voicemail asking if he was okay and if he would need any dinner. And with her fingers crossed, she just hoped that he would walk through the front door any minute. But after another hour soon passed by with his absence persisting, Eunice decided to call her husband Maxwell up from the basement away from his service to inform him on the situation with Darius. And given the concerning details, he immediately jumped in the car and drove over to his son's place of work, hoping he may have been covering for a late shift and his phone battery had died. But after arriving outside, he quickly noticed that the lights were off and there were no signs of life coming from the building. So with fear in his heart, Maxwell then rushed home empty-handed, declaring to his family that Darius was not at work and therefore his life could be in danger. So, with the situation continuously escalating, they felt there was no other option than to call the Stafford County Sheriff's Department to officially report their 22-year-old son as missing. On Thursday the 25th of January, in the very early hours of the morning, the police would receive that harrowing phone call from Darius Appiah, where she claimed that her 22-year-old son had not returned home after work and how this behaviour was incredibly unusual. At first, the police were only mildly concerned, and given that Darius was an adult, they responded by saying how it was more than likely that he had simply chosen to spend the night elsewhere and would be in touch eventually. After all, it had only been around 10 hours since they had last heard from him, so it was very possible that he was just spending the night out with somebody. However, given the insistence of Eunice and Maxwell, the Stafford sheriffs eventually agreed to file the missing person report and to send officers out later that day to start the investigation. Eunice and Maxwell were appreciative of the response, however, understandably, they wanted answers as soon as possible. So rather than waiting for the police, they decided to take the case into their own hands by heading back out to their son's place of work to see if he would turn up for his next scheduled shift. At the time, they were quietly hoping that he had simply chosen to spend the night at a friend's house, and maybe his phone had died, which would explain why he hadn't responded. But unfortunately, this optimistic view would soon come crashing down when they arrived at the place of work at around 10 AM, only to find that Darius was not there. However, according to the manager, his shift was actually due to commence at 1 PM. So with this, the family regained a very small sliver of hope that their son could still be due to show his face once again. So you can only imagine the truly devastating feeling they would soon experience when they showed up at 1 PM, only to find that Darius was still nowhere to be seen. At this point, Maxwell and Eunice were running out of options. They had called the police, checked all the locations that they thought he could be, but despite their efforts, Darius continued to elude them. So with little else to try, they then began calling their relatives to see if they had perhaps heard from Darius. But just as before, the Appiah family were met with nothing but despair, as it soon became clear that nobody had spoken to the young man since the day he disappeared. It seemed like everything they tried would just lead them to a dead end, so the family were once again left at the hands of the police in the hopes that they would be able to gather some evidence soon enough. But refusing to sit back and wait, Eunice and Maxwell continued to search throughout the day, and despite having a low chance of success, they once again headed over to their son's place of work, where they would desperately ask the manager if Darius had turned up for his shift. But as I'm sure you have already guessed, this question was met with an unfortunate no, leaving the Appiah family filled with concern, as they worried about what had truly happened to their boy. In response, they then unlocked their cell phone and called the Stafford County Sheriff's Department to further escalate the situation by providing them with all of the new information they had gathered throughout the day. They then requested that more officers should be attached to the case, as it was a lot more serious than they had discussed earlier that morning. So, after taking these claims very seriously, the police vowed to increase their efforts in the search for Darius, but it wouldn't be long before they would make a startling discovery. On Friday the 26th of January, Eunice Appiah would receive a phone call from the Stafford County Sheriff's Department claiming that they had found an SUV that they were certain belonged to Darius. However, the vehicle was locked, and so they were unable to gain access, and therefore unable to retrieve any of the evidence that was likely inside. So, with a mixture of fear and adrenaline, Eunice and her husband Maxwell scoured the house in search of a spare key, and luckily it didn't take long before they successfully located a set of keys to the car, and quickly rushed out the door to meet with the police. The vehicle was found parked and seemingly abandoned in the parking lot of Alum Spring Park, which was located around 5 miles away from where Darius was last seen. So the series of events leading up to his disappearance was starting to become a bit clearer, but there was still a huge missing piece of the puzzle, as nobody knew why the car would end up in this location, and nobody could verify how it got there. Nevertheless, Eunice and Maxwell eventually arrived at the Alum Spring parking lot, where they handed the keys to the police and allowed them to search the vehicle for any clues. During the inspection, there wasn't much to uncover. However, one chilling detail that they were able to gather was that the food Darius had bought that day was still yet to be eaten, with just a few bites missing from the bag. So, with this in mind, it soon became clear to the police that Darius had started eating the DoorDash order before abruptly stopping and leaving the vehicle for an unknown reason. But to make matters worse, given the location of which the vehicle was discovered, it was difficult to pinpoint where Darius could have got to, given that the Alum Spring Park is a relatively large area of over 35 acres, with the wider surrounding areas expanding to around 400 acres, meaning if Darius was somewhere hidden in the woods, it could potentially take days to find him. Upon this update in the case, the police then brought out the sniffer dogs to try and track the whereabouts of Darius using a jacket that was also found in the SUV. But given the potentially horrific nature of what the police may find, they refused to let Eunice or Maxwell assist in the search, explaining that if he was somewhere in the park, it was highly likely that the news wouldn't be positive. However, to the surprise of most people, after an entire day of searching, the officers were still unable to come up with any further evidence or any signs of Darius in the park, which led them to start hypothesizing other theories about what may have happened to the young man. So with this, they returned to the drawing board to continue their investigation. The next step was to try and track his last movements before disappearing, to see if they could gather any intel as to why his car ended up at the Alum Spring Park. They then checked Darius's credit card history to see if this would give them any clues, and this is where they first discovered that the 22-year-old had actually purchased the food from a restaurant on Mine Road. From here, they then spoke to the staff who confirmed seeing Darius at around 2:21 p.m. that day, but they were unable to provide any further information. The police then checked surveillance footage of the local area to see if they could track the movements of Darius after this. However, it would seem that no definitive conclusions were ever drawn here, as any information gathered has not been released to the public as of yet. But one piece of evidence that was particularly unnerving was that Darius had not used his credit cards since that day, which illustrated that the young man may have been in danger, as opposed to simply running away from home. But just as before, the day soon turned to night, with the Stafford County Sheriff's Department still in the dark as to what really happened to Darius, leaving the family even more desperate for answers. So, refusing to just sit at home and wait, Eunice Appiah jumped into action once again on that Saturday night as she would make a post on Facebook asking if anybody in the local area would be willing to search the park again the next day. And to her surprise, the response she would receive from the public was incredibly positive, to say the least. On Sunday the 28th of January, a group of over 100 people, including volunteers, friends and local residents, left their homes on that cold, wet winter morning, with the hope of finding Darius before it was too late. They soon arrived at Alum Spring Park in the later hours of the morning, and quickly commenced a widespread search across over 400 acres of parkland, where they would find some small pieces of potential evidence which they would in turn pass over to the police. However, despite the efforts of the entire community coming together, it would seem that none of the possible leads that were uncovered during the day would provide the police with any useful information. In fact, later that day, the Fredericksburg Police Department would come out to state that officers were now assisting the Stafford County Sheriff's Office in searching for the missing young man. But one harrowing detail which they tagged on to the end of this statement was that based on the evidence so far, they didn't feel there was any threat to the public. So, rightfully concerned with these statements and the surrounding circumstances of the case, Eunice and Maxwell were at a loss as to where to look next. There was still no activity on their son's cell phone or credit cards. There were no official sightings to work with, and with no physical evidence to speak of, the reality of the situation was only escalating in severity, leaving the entire family petrified of what could possibly happen next. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But at the very least, the police are continuing to scour the town of Fredericksburg, and the search efforts only seem to be increasing, with the awareness of this missing person case beginning to spread across the nation. The Appiah family have also come out to thank everybody who has shown their support thus far, and based on a video they posted earlier this week, it would seem that the police have been extremely cooperative and are taking calls day and night, so we can only hope that it will be a matter of time before Darius is finally found. However, with the young man being missing now for over a week, the probability of his safe return is growing more and more unlikely as the days pass. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, as I normally do when making these videos, I try to hypothesize an explanation that could potentially provide the basis for a happy ending here. But to be completely transparent, I'm seriously struggling to think of any scenario where Darius comes out of this unscathed. Sometimes I mention the possibility of a victim maybe running away from home, but with Darius, he really doesn't seem like the type. Not to mention, he hasn't used his cell phone or bank account in over a week now, so the likelihood that he is surviving out there all alone isn't great. However, a theory which was actually posed by his own father, Maxwell, was that Darius could be held up somewhere in a basement or a makeshift prison, where he's being held captive. This certainly wouldn't be a good thing, but at the very least, I suppose it would mean that he could still be alive, and therefore there may be a chance of getting him home. But either way, I truly commend Maxwell and the rest of the family for staying so positive in this incredibly difficult time. If this is in fact the case though, why would somebody have chosen to capture Darius? And also, how would they have even accomplished this? Well, there are a number of possible reasons, but I think the most credible answer to these questions would have to be that Darius was either a victim selected at random or due to his ethnicity, especially given the prevalence of racism that is still alive and well in the state of Virginia. But regardless of why he was chosen, if he was lured out there to Alum Spring Park, how would they have managed to achieve this? Is it possible that Darius just happened to drive over there to have his lunch, and then somebody took the opportunity to act while he was alone in the parking lot? Well, I guess that's plausible, but personally I think a much more accurate theory would have to be that he was lured out there by somebody who he was planning on meeting that day. We do not know how much food he purchased from his DoorDash order, but it is possible that he could have bought that food to share with someone at the park, perhaps even as a picnic date. But after arriving and letting the person into his car, something happened, and Darius was then forced or dragged out of the vehicle by the very same person, or maybe even an accomplice. Now, if this was the case, I think it would be important for the police to try and investigate if Darius was possibly online dating at the time, as I can think of no other reason why he would have met up with somebody in the parking lot of a park. But before I get too carried away, it must be said that the police have not yet revealed why they think Darius was at the park that day, or even if he was the one to drive there in the first place. After all, it's very possible that somebody else could have driven his SUV and abandoned it there to send the police on a wild goose chase. So maybe another important piece of evidence the police should be continuing to examine would be to find Darius on surveillance footage, so they can confirm if it was in fact him who drove the car to the park that day. However, before I move on to the next theory, I can't help but draw some parallels from this story to another missing person case that occurred around 2.5 years ago in a town called Peru in Illinois, where another young African American man named Jelani Day would suddenly disappear, and at first, all they would discover was his abandoned car next to the woods with a half-smoked joint. Now, if you're familiar with this case, then you probably already know why I'm choosing to speak on it, but if you're not, I highly recommend you search up the case of Jelani Day after this video. I actually covered the story myself a few months back, so I'll leave a link to my personal take on the story in the description below. But to be honest, there are loads of other in-depth documentaries out there that also cover the events in great detail. But just to quickly sum up the story for the sake of this video, Jelani Day was a 25-year-old medical student who was well on his way to becoming a doctor, when he would suddenly miss an appointment with his professor, and instead, he would choose to drive 60 miles away to the neighbouring town of Peru, for reasons still unknown. His car was then found a few days later abandoned in the woods behind a YMCA parking lot, but as I mentioned, the police would also find a half-smoked joint in the car. Now I should say he was captured on surveillance cameras purchasing this joint. However, it is still unclear as to why he only smoked half of it. But either way, despite finding his vehicle, it still took the police a further week of investigating until they finally discovered a body in a nearby river, and unfortunately, it belonged to Jelani. To this day, the case remains unsolved, with the police leaning towards self-infliction as the most likely cause of death, whether by accident or on purpose. But many believe that the true explanation is far more controversial. There is still no irrefutable evidence to prove that Jelani was meeting up with someone, but given that his car was found next to a YMCA, and he abandoned a meeting with his professor, you can only imagine he had to be meeting up with somebody, which would have more than likely been a date of some kind. So to bring this back around to Darius, could it be possible that he too was planning on meeting somebody that day? Perhaps someone from the internet? But after arriving, something incredibly dark took place. Well, at this point, there really is no way of knowing for sure, but the evidence we have been able to gather so far certainly doesn't paint this case in the best of lights, so I personally wouldn't rule it out as a possibility. But taking a step back from this theory, what else could possibly explain what really happened to Darius Appiah? Well, a common theme on this channel that has been continuously appearing since I started covering these types of cases is that human trafficking and organ harvesting are always strong candidates, with the ever-increasing black market continuing to thrive in today's society. It's a very sensitive subject, so I won't speak too much on it out of respect for his family. But with the rise in missing young black men in recent years, it has to be said that there could be a hidden agenda that is lurking beneath the surface. Now, if you're not new to my channel, then you are probably sick of me explaining how and why these practices take place. But essentially, it comes down to two main factors, which are money and greed. And to be honest, these traits come hand in hand. But could there actually be any merit in this dark theory when it comes to Darius? Personally, I'm not so sure. There was no compelling evidence left at the scene, so it's impossible to say. But to be fair, I also can't dispute it as a possibility, and given the rising rates of missing people that are somehow remaining missing in today's world of extreme surveillance, I unfortunately feel that you have to keep an open mind to these things. Also, it should probably be said that another conclusion to this story could be that Darius is still out there in Alum Spring Park, just waiting to be found, whether he is still alive or not. But until we know for sure, we have to keep searching and spreading awareness of this case, as regardless of the conclusion, his family certainly deserves some closure. Now, just before I end the video, I wanted to quickly shout out the GoFundMe page that was recently set up by the family, as they are working towards a $50,000 goal and are only at about $16,000 so far. The money will of course be going towards the investigation, but if you're unable to spare anything right now, I'm sure any awareness you can raise for the case will also be greatly appreciated by the family. So I will leave links to the GoFundMe page and their social media accounts below. But anyway, on that note, I think I'll leave this video here. But if you have any other theories of your own that may help explain what really happened to Darius Appiah, please leave your comments down below and I will do my best to get back to you. But until then, thank you so much for watching and make sure to subscribe to the channel for updates on these stories. Also, if you would like to hear more about some of the other cases that I featured in this video, such as Jelani Day, feel free to check out the playlist on screen now.